Good afternoon and happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to the first recording of the weekly remote rundown. This is going to be a interactive session with me. I'm Jim Reese with three of our employment and labor attorneys from Offit Kurman. And we're going to talk about topics of the week and what people are talking about, what kind of inquiries the attorneys are receiving, and the conversations they've been having. So I'm Jim Reese, Director of Business Development for Offit Kurman, and we'll go around the horn with introductions, starting with Sarah Sawyer.
Hi, I'm Sarah Sawyer. I'm a labor employment attorney, as Jim said, in our Baltimore office. I work with these other two fine folks here, Veronica and Russell, advise business owners on everything they need to know from compliance to litigation, especially relevant right now, what they need to know about COVID-19 and fast-changing policies that are changing every single day, sometimes hourly. So looking forward to seeing you every Friday.
Hi, everyone. I'm Veronica Yu. I'm also a labor and employment attorney with Sarah and Russell in the Baltimore office. We generally have the same background, so I won't be too repetitive, but I really enjoy being able to counsel business owners with their problems, as well as with my litigation background, help them when they have to deal with the terrible misfortune of being sued. But I really like being able to handle both sides of the coin. So I'm excited to be a part of this.
My name is Russell Berger, the last person here to introduce myself. It's nice to have you with us today. And for me, it's nice to see my colleagues who I haven't seen in person for about a month now. So it's nice to have some human contact outside of the folks I'm living with. I've been with Offit Kurman for about 8.5 years. A member of the employment group, and like Veronica and Sarah, that involves both business counseling and litigation. Obviously, right now, we're very heavy on the counseling front, which I think makes a lot of sense, obviously, given the current crisis. And hopefully, most people listen to counseling and we can avoid the litigation problems that we expect to come down the road for a lot of folks related to COVID-19.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all three for your introductions, and let's get started here. So, beginning with Sarah, I know you've been busy doing some webinars and Zoom calls like everybody else. What are people talking about? What are people seem most concerned about that you're speaking with?
I'd say kind of the transition has been over the last week or two from what are these acts, what's the CARES Act, what's the Family First Act, how do they apply to what's next. And I've applied now, how do I get the money, and am I going to be able to get the money? And then, just kind of around the actual implementation of these acts. So I know I've been hearing a lot from employers about applying for the Paycheck Protection Program and some other loan programs through the state and through federal legislation. I know I've been hearing a lot of frustration around getting those loans, getting the applications in. I know a lot of lenders are really scrambling to get this done and are pushing things out, not accepting applications, only accepting some applications. So really just seeing a lot of everything really being very slow, the process being very slow and cumbersome. Seeing a similar thing in the unemployment realm as well, with employees not being able to get through to unemployment. So, really just moving through the understanding of the act phase to how do we actually figure out how these things are going to work. And it seems really like the state and the lenders and stuff are trying to figure it out too.
Okay, thank you. Veronica, what are you hearing?
Well, I would just add for the unemployment portion, I've been hearing a lot of people saying that their benefits are being denied, and it's typically something on the employer end, or they just don't have the right information. So if you want to help out your employees, you might facilitate giving that information so that they don't get denied benefits. But on a different note, I've been hearing a lot about changing current policies can I do it? And I'll get into that a little more specifically, as well as drafting new policies. And I know that currently seems like the last thing that employers want to have to deal with right now, but it really is an important tool because, you know, good policies are always a good way to protect your business. And it also gives your employees clear instruction on the policies and what's expected of them during a really stressful time. And I think alleviating some employee stress will go a long way for both the employee and the employer. So as to current policies, a recent question that came in was whether you can change your PTO policy in the midst of the pandemic. And as you know, there's no federal or state law that requires PTO, so your policy really is your guide. So if you don't make any changes to it, you've got to follow that policy to a T. There's nothing prohibiting you from making changes, but you just want to make sure you don't apply the new policy inconsistently amongst your employees, and also that you don't take away any benefits that they've already accrued. So it's okay to do that just as long as you comply with, you know, Maryland's sick and safe leave requirements, and just be aware of that. Another issue looking forward, new policies that I've been asked about are the Families First Act. Employers are calling all the time, what does this mean? How does this apply to my employees? And we found that really laying out just a clear policy that they can distribute to their employees has really alleviated some of that stress. So that's been another great policy. Some other suggestions might be a work from home policy. It lets you set your expectations out very clearly for your employees, and it gives everyone a roadmap to use in perhaps uncharted territories if your employees have never worked from home. So if you do end up making a new policy, just make sure it's in writing so that everyone's on the same page.
Great. Well, you guys covered a lot. Russell, you have, I'm sure you've got something to add to that.
Is that because I'm a lawyer or because there's a lot going on?
Both.
Well, fair enough. I certainly can add to that. One of the things that when this crisis first started about a month ago, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act came out within about a week or so, and it made us, that's where we spent a lot of our time, just kind of learning the law, getting out in front of it, helping employers to put policies in place and to understand what they were going to have to do. And then a couple of weeks later, the Department of Labor came out with regulations and guidance that in some cases filled some of the obvious gaps in that law. In other cases, changed things that, that maybe differ from kind of the letter of the law as it was passed by Congress. So the law has evolved a little bit in the couple of weeks that we've had it in place. And this is kind of weird for us as lawyers. Usually we deal with laws that are like decades old and that people have been fighting over for, the better part of a century. And there's a lot of case law and we still find the gray areas. And this is law that was written very quickly, that leaves lots of room for interpretation, lots of gaps, and no one's litigated any of this yet. So we spent a lot of time catching up this week on how those gaps are being filled. And so a lot of the questions that we were getting in week 1 or week 2, where we were saying, what kind of guidance, we were getting these questions and we were saying, we don't know yet. We have to wait for the guidance. We have to wait for the Department of Labor to point us in the right direction. Now we're starting to get some answers filled in. So for example, one of the things that makes an employee eligible for emergency paid sick leave is that they are subject to a government order of isolation or quarantine. And when that first came out, no one knew exactly what that meant. And there was a lot of reason to think that that was going to mean like you were on a cruise ship, you're quarantined for 14 days until you can go back into the general population. However, the Department of Labor has interpreted that way more broadly than certainly I think the majority of the employment lawyers in our firm expected. And although it was a topic of internal debate that we spent many hours going back and forth on, but they've interpreted it way more broadly. So things like here in Maryland, like the stay-at-home order, would be in isolation or quarantine order that could, in theory, qualify someone for protection and benefits under the emergency paid sick leave prong of Families First. In addition, there's some other things like that where we filled in some gaps, like intermittent leave is permissible under both the emergency paid sick leave and the expanded FMLA components of Families First. That's still not totally fleshed out, but it is something where I think it is permissible. The employer's got to be on board with it, and something that employers can work through with their employees.
Okay, great. Sarah, you mentioned, you talked a little bit about the banks and how they're responding to these various, this onslaught of people applying for financial relief. Where do these programs stand? You know, I hear rumors that some of those programs are already out of money, or they've temporarily suspended the programs. Will there be a second run of some of these programs in a week or two? Tell us where we are on the various relief programs, federal, state, SBA, et cetera.
So with the federal process, I'm hearing pretty universally that people are just getting their applications processed right now. I've heard from a lot of employers that their applications are being accepted now throughout this week. It was supposed to start on Monday, but a lot of lenders still and banks are still just not ready for it. So you know, I'm hearing from some clients even that they're going to multiple different lenders, multiple different banks, trying to get in the door. And so the federal program, the money's still there, and it's just getting access to that money, filing the application, getting in with the lenders. And you know, so we'll see where that all ends up. It's definitely in progress, and they're starting to accept applications. I haven't heard from any of my clients yet that they've actually received the money or received any funds yet. Most people are just still in the process. As for the state loans, there are several that are out of funding right now. I was actually, right before this, I was on a call where we were talking to someone in the Department of Commerce regarding those loan programs. And, you know, it's not to say that there's no funding for the future, that there won't be funding for some of these state loan programs again, but right now they're not anticipating that happening in the near future. It's not never, but it's really all still in such flux, and it's still really changing daily. I'll definitely, you can find it on my LinkedIn, but there's actually a relief wizard that you know, I've been working with some of the state Department of Commerce and MindGrub, which is the development of this relief business. Relief wizard that's going to actually help you figure out which programs, state and federal programs, you might be able to apply for, you might be eligible for, and also which programs no longer have funding. So, you know, definitely check that out. We're updating that daily, or trying to keep, you know, within 24 hours or so if there's any changes. So that's one great tool if you're a business in Maryland to figure out what you can apply for, what you might be eligible for, what you need to be considering. And it'll prompt you with several questions that you answer about your business to kind of help you sort through. And we'll also provide you links of where to either apply for things or who to get in touch with. So really a tool that we're trying to put out there to help businesses navigate exactly what you're talking about. And like, what can I apply for? What has funding? What doesn't have funding? And all of those pieces. What's new? What's coming out? So definitely would encourage you to check it out.
Yeah, you know, Sarah, I heard kind of secondhand of the first business I've heard of actually getting money through the PPP, a business out in Colorado, and I've only heard it secondhand, so I'm not entirely sure. But that's like one out of.
Does it exist?
Yeah, that's one out of like 1,000 that I know of that have actually gotten money yet. So hopefully it's on its way, but I don't think anyone's using it to fund payroll this week.
Have you heard
Veronica?
this?
I was just going to add a funny story about that because I do personally know a nonprofit that has received their they haven't received their funding, it's on the way. But I also heard a story about a business going to the bank and getting their PPP loan in, let's say, a $70,000 loan. And they called an HR company that they were working with and said, does this sound right? And it turned out the bank had miscalculated how much money they were actually owed. So they were owed, let's say, 88,000 instead of 70,000, and the HR consultant was able to call the bank and get it figured out, and the bank honored the higher amount. So even, the bank industry is having trouble dealing with applying these new laws.
Yeah, it's a good reason for business owners to stay on top of it and do the math themselves and not just rely on any third party to get it right.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk a little bit about unemployment and generally dealing with employees. A lot of talk. I know the three of you are fielding inquiries about whether it's better to let somebody go in termination or to furlough them. What's the difference, and why would you recommend one over the other? And then as you talk about that also, I want to segue into the unemployment situation, because we've all heard stories about people not even able to get through to the state unemployment folks to even apply for unemployment. So, Veronica, why don't you start us off and tell us about how people are dealing with their employees and what's going on in the unemployment scene.
I mean, I think it's really fact specific for the business and what works for the company. If you can't keep your employees on payroll, there's nothing wrong with having to go in that direction. Other employers are choosing to furlough their employees, which is keeping them on as temporary. So the good thing there is even if you're not laid off and there's still a reduction in hours, you're able to apply for unemployment. And the unemployment, the people who can apply has been broadened under the CARES Act. So more people are being able to access unemployment benefits. But as you mentioned, there's this big issue with being able to get through and getting your application processed properly.
Yeah, and I could piggyback on that a little bit because I've probably answered the question, what's the difference between a layoff, a furlough, and a reduction in hours or reduction in pay about 100 times this month. A layoff is complete separation of employment, termination. It might be, it might not be for any reason other than you just can't afford to have these employees anymore. You have to shut down this line of business. Whatever it is, it's termination. You would offboard the employees. Complete separation doesn't really, the reasoning doesn't really matter. It's the end of the employment. Whereas a furlough historically is kind of used when there's a cash flow problem. So for example, an employee might be furloughed for a day, and that way the company saves a day's worth of wages and it helps them get through a tight period of cash flow. Maybe sometimes it's a week. Generally, you see this more on the government side of things than in the private sector. That's usually how a furlough is used. So you're still an active employee, you're just not working and not getting paid. When that's done for a day or for a week, that makes a lot of sense, because why would you offboard someone and then rehire them a day later or a week later? In this context, it's a little bit uncertain because we don't know how long anyone's going to be out. We don't know when this is going to end. We know there's going to be a light at the end of the tunnel. We know we're going to want to rehire people. We know, a lot of businesses are going to want to mash the gas pedal at that point. And that's generally the benefit of a furlough is the employees don't go anywhere. They're still there. But, it's not something right now. It's hard to kind of imagine how that plays out because you just don't know how long that period is going to be. And while they're still active, they may still qualify for benefits under your various benefit plans, including your health insurance. And we could probably do an hour just on ERISA and the nuance of that whole process, which I didn't know much about, but now I do, thanks to this crisis, because it implicates the hiring and firing decisions that we're talking about here. And again, that's not something that, as Veronica said, I don't think that's something that we can really evaluate kind of generically. That's a very fact-specific, individualized analysis. And then the last option generally that employers are considering are reduction in pay, reduction in hours. So for non-exempt employees, meaning they're paid by the hour, and they don't qualify for an exemption, all you have to do is reduce the hours. That reduces the amount of pay, and that's a way to save money. For exempt employees, they have to be paid, if they work it all in a week, they have to be paid their full salary for the week. So you can't really switch them midweek. You can't reduce their hours. You have to reduce their base pay. And in Maryland, there's a full pay period advance notice is required to do that. So you have to have a little bit of planning to go into it. And so that's kind of the general high level of this. But now that we've got the CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection Program, that complicates this further because there's things like full-time equivalency. What does that mean? And can you reduce someone's pay and still have them be a full-time employee? And do I really need to, if I furlough people, maybe I don't need to, maybe I can keep them on the payroll because now I'm going to get this PPP money and it's going to be able to fund my payroll for the next 2 months. So the analysis has evolved now that we've got potentially some other options of income for businesses.
And if I can summarize what everyone said, it depends. It depends.
Sarah, I know some of these relief programs require employers to bring back furloughed and maybe terminated employees, maybe up to 90%, I think I heard. So what's the strategy for the businesses that you're talking to that have applied and have applied for some of these programs? What's the strategy for the next couple of weeks as they wait for their application to be approved or wait for their funds to be delivered?
Yeah, a lot of employers are going to be bringing employees back for that reason if they are deciding to move forward with the protection program. And so that is just depending on the industry, depending on the business model, depending on kind of what they want to move forward with. I know it kind of varies depending on businesses that have closed their doors versus businesses that are still operating maybe at a reduced capacity, and then they're bringing employees back to be able to take advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program. People who have had their employees on and they've just been fronting the cost of all of these things and hoping to be able to make it through and just continue to pay employees. So it's been running the gamut as far as what people are deciding to do and take advantage of, and just kind of the interactions between that and the other laws. So I was just thinking when Russell was talking about the furloughing versus laying off and all these different pieces, I know a lot of employers, between trying to navigate the CARES Act and the Families First Act, it's very much, what am I on the hook for? What am I responsible for? If I'm bringing employees back, now I've got to also think about the Families First Act. If I've got, I'm paying employees under the Paycheck Protection Program, and then now they go out for COVID-19 related reasons, they're no longer able to work or something happens. Well, what do I do with those people? And an important nuance there is that if you're using Paycheck Protection Program money to fund your payroll and then someone goes out on leave, you shouldn't be attributing those PPP funds to that leave, because that leave gets paid for separately out of the Families First Act. So really, to say that there's a lot of strategy involved is kind of an understatement. It's really, you have to put a lot of different pieces together and really think about all of these different acts and programs and how you're going to actually allocate those funds when you actually get them in the door, how you're going to actually make sure that you're complying with having enough employees on board to get the loan forgiveness, and then what you're going to do with them once they're they're back on, especially if you have a physical business where you have people coming in. So there's really just a lot of pieces to that strategy.
So Veronica, there's so many different ways that you can spin these programs, and I've heard tons of questions about them. What government body or who will have the final say regarding these various relief programs, whether you actually whether you are able to comply and receive some of these funds? So I've heard people ask the question, well, what if I had 50 employees and I terminated 40 of them, and I need to bring back 90% of them to get my funds, but 10 of them are sick with the coronavirus. So who makes the final call whether that business would be able to apply and receive these funds?
I think it obviously depends under whether it's a state or federal relief package that they're seeking those funds. And so if it's state, it would be dealt with on the state level. If it's federal, it would be on the federal level. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think it just depends. You know, it's some, like New York, I know federal legislation came out and then New York adopted their own version of it. And so that would apply to New Yorkers. It just depends what specific benefits you're looking for and where the relief is coming from.
Okay. Russell, you mentioned how, we've got decades of case law for most of the issues that the three of you have dealt with in your careers. Now we're talking about, weeks worth of case law, if that much. How fast are these various laws changing, and what do you see happening in the next, say, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, as it relates to the laws?
Yeah, well, funny story. Sarah and I were doing a webinar I think 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about the possibility of the CARES Act passing and what it might look like. And it passed during the middle of our webinar. So we got to break that news during our webinar. And I can say, out of all the webinars that I bet all of us on this call have done, we've never actually broken news of a brand new law mid-webinar. So that's how fast stuff has been coming. And I actually kind of feel like this week has been an opportunity for us as lawyers and for business owners, hopefully, to catch their breath a little bit. We've kind of, there's been no new laws this week, at least not at the federal level. So now we're getting guidance, we're digging into the detail, and instead of having case law and being able to go back and research, what we're getting now is Department of Labor guidance and fact sheets and regulations that we can start to analyze. And so we've gone from there is no law to we spent all weekend reading hundreds of pages of brand new law to, okay, now we can start being practical about it. We can start being tactical, and we can start helping clients to be strategic with this. And I think that's really where we're going to spend a lot of our time the next month or two, is figuring out how to be strategic and pragmatic about piecing these different laws together in ways that help our clients the most.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that. I think some of the best advice right now is just to tell your clients to pause and take a breath and consider how these different laws will impact your business and what makes most sense for you. Because there's a lot of information out there and a lot of things have changed that you don't want to jump the gun and do something that might not fit your business model.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, I mean, I think that is definitely true. But there is mixed messaging in the fact that there's a sense of urgency paired with that. So I think that it has been a struggle for, I think, maybe every professional in every industry and then every business owner out there, to paint a really broad stroke, to really find that balance between not moving too quickly, but being agile enough to make it through this, receive the funding. Obviously there's a lot of fear around, well, a lot of these programs, especially the state programs, they ran out of funding. So how do I make sure that I act quickly enough to make sure that I'm getting hands on money or seizing opportunities and I'm able to make it through while also protecting myself and making sure that I'm not misstepping, getting myself in trouble, or I'm going to get sued later. So I think that's a lot of the waters that I know that the three of us have been having to navigate through with employers. Because it's not like all the employment laws, the ADA, Russell mentioned a couple of things. It's like, it's not like all that stuff went away when these new laws came into play. So it's really a balance of trying to be agile and make it through while not misstepping and doing something wrong, or it's not going to be the best strategy or best case scenario for your business.
Obviously, this crisis has impacted everyone. I'd be interested to know from the three of you, you're fielding many inquiries. What do you hear from different types of businesses and different sizes of businesses? How are the questions different? How are their situations different? Again, break it down by size of business, small, medium, mid, large size business, and industry. Are the questions you're getting different based on the size or the industry vertical that the business might be in? Let's start with Veronica.
I would say in the past couple of weeks, at least for me, the inquiries have been getting what is this law providing for and what am I entitled to and how do I put that in motion. So they've been kind of generic, just trying to understand the new laws that have been put out there. But there are, depending on the industry, like for example, car dealerships, they're paid differently and laws were changing left and right for them a couple of weeks ago. So there might be specific questions there. And we've been trying to keep up with the guidance on those laws and other resources that are available. And it's just a constant communication and just checking in with each other and trying to navigate the general laws for the specific industries.
How about you, Russell? What are you hearing?
Yeah, well, different industries, I think it does make a little bit of difference. I mean, there are industries that are so far unaffected. They're the essential businesses that are still out there operating, and their inquiries are a lot more about how do we deal with people coming into the workplace with the fever? How do we handle protecting our ongoing workforce? On the other hand, on the other extreme, there's clients that unfortunately just aren't able to operate in this environment. I'm a big sports guy, and I saw an article the other day that was talking about the impact of not having a baseball season and not having opening day was having on certain downtown bars and restaurants. I know a lot of restaurants are trying to do carry out and some version, but restaurants and other businesses just aren't able to operate at all. It's a very different conversation because there's nothing they can even do to float on by for a few months. They just have to kind of hit the pause button for a while. So, and then there's everything in between, and that's industry specific to some extent. And sometimes it just depends on the business itself. So, like you're talking about size, some bigger companies are probably a little bit better able to weather the storm. But they might be the ones that are more inclined to have layoffs or furloughs of some kind because, frankly, they just have more maneuverability because they have more numbers.
I would say in regard to size, to feedback on the size aspect of it, there's a couple different things that you have to consider based on your size. One, just determining what applies to you. I've had a lot of clients that, they've got a lot of different divisions or entities that are somewhat related, but they're not directly working together. So for some employers, it's really easy to say I'm under 500 or I'm over 500. It's cut and dry. Or I can apply, I'm a small business, I can apply for a PPP loan, or I can't. But then there's a lot of businesses out there that it's a lot more complicated depending on their level of divisions and different, entities and whether they're related. And there's different tests under the different acts and different things that they have to consider. So for some employers, it's a complicated process to even get through the first hurdle of, does this apply to me? Can I seek relief under this? And also, I think another thing that's really affected by size is going to be the ramp up after this. So, if you're a small business that really relies on subject matter experts in a certain field or a certain industry, or you do have a really high cost of employee acquisition or training or different things, and you have key employees that are really going to be hard for you to get back or ramp back up, or I think just depending on the industry and the size of the business, it's really going to make a difference when there is an end to this and we all come out of this, because there's going to be an end to this. There has to be. That's what I'm hearing. So we don't know when it's going to be, but just really, I think there's going to be some considerations on the back end too on how you're going to be able to ramp back up, and that's going to be something that employers should be considering right now as they make decisions about furloughs, layoffs, continued operations, how much to expend now versus try to save, and just different things to consider in different industries when you think about when the doors are going to open again.
You just made a great segue, so I appreciate the layup, because my next question, and we'll start with Veronica, is we're now in survival mode, and the inquiries you're receiving from clients and prospects and business owners is exactly that. They're in survival mode. But when we are finally on the other side of this curve, as I like to call it, and we have we're working in a sort of new normal conditions, because there will definitely be some changes. How do you see the new normal? What's the new normal going to look like for your clients, and how will it impact your work and your job as a labor and employment attorney giving advice to your clients? What's the new normal look like, and how will that impact the advice that you're giving and the work that you're doing for your clients?
Well, the current normal is, look at us right now doing this webinar from our homes. And so I think being able to communicate with your clients virtually, not just by the phone, because it's important for them to feel comfortable with the advice that you're giving. And face-to-face interaction we've always said an in-person meeting is better than doing it by the phone, especially better than doing it by email. A lot of things can't be summarized completely in an email, and you want to be able to give your clients, answer all their questions that they might have that pop to the top of their head. So I think being flexible and working different hours so that you can cater to your clients is going to be very important. But I think it's hard to say what the new normal is going to be. When things start to clear up, I know it's been on the news a lot. It's not going to be like flipping the light switch back on and we all get to return to our normal lives. It's definitely going to be, phases. And we'll all have to, deal with that as it comes. But luckily I'm sure Russell and Sarah feel similarly, we can still do what we have to do at home. And the technology has really benefited there. So other than, courts are closed and some other aspects of our job have slowed down, things are still happening and things are still moving along. And I have a deadline today, deadlines are still here. So I don't see it being much different for us. It's just the way we communicate, I think, is going to be a big change.
Russell?
Yeah, I think that's pretty well said. And, I think there'll be some nuances to, as I think Sarah said earlier, these laws that have existed for decades still exist. And now they were written at a time when, there's no fax machine, let alone video conferencing. So, in today's world, we're going to find new ways to apply old laws. And I think that's something that's going to play out a little bit over, the short term here. And there might be some flexibility in how it plays out in the short term. But moving forward, if we're more inclined towards technology, I think some of these practices will be different and applications will be different in that context as well.
Yeah, I'm interested too so I like to listen to podcasts, and I was listening to the Tony Robinson podcast on my walk with my dog this morning, and they were discussing kind of an interesting concept around the fact of taking this time to kind of look at your old life, as they're putting it, and say, well, what do I miss about it, and what do I not miss about it, and kind of figuring out what are some of the good things about the way we're communicating now, or these different pieces, and how are we going to bring them into our new normal. And so to both Veronica and Russell's point, some of the good things that we've had with interacting with our clients or doing these types of things is we're doing more webinars, or we're doing more video calls with our clients, or hours are shifting, there's more flexibility. I mean, whatever it may be. So I'm really curious to see how both us as attorneys in our practice group and us in our individual practices will kind of take those lessons of like, what are the good things that we like about this change? What are the things we don't miss, and how we kind of use that to pivot how we communicate and how our practices change. And I'm curious to see how businesses do that as well. I mean, I think, a lot of our business clients will, depending on their industry, they'll be doing things differently, and they'll have a whole new set of fact patterns and situations to bring to us to ask us about. And so I'm excited to see that part of it, and how businesses develop. And that's one of the awesome things about the business community. I'm really enjoying seeing how trying to be agile and pivot and make it through this in survival mode. And I'm excited to see kind of the new challenges that brings, and the new opportunities for us to help.
Will there be any changes in technicalities of the work that you do? For example, the employee handbooks that the three of you, I know all three of you work on them and produce them. Will there now be in a section for pandemics? Will there be any changes in those handbooks based on new laws, as that we're dealing with now? What do you see as technical changes in the work that you do?
So going back to when there was the threat of H1N1, there's a big trend to include pandemic policies in handbooks. And I think, as a practice, the whole industry has gotten away from that, because it wasn't a big issue. We survived, and none of this came into play. And then when COVID-19 came to the States, it became something that businesses wanted to have a policy around. So I would suspect that we're going to have some type of pandemic policy in handbooks, probably for, maybe on a more permanent basis now, because obviously H1N1 was kind of a blip in the radar, and this certainly is not that. So, some of the practices will be longer lasting. And by the same token, more so than just handbooks, just employment practices in general are going to evolve. And, I think, as scary and horrible as the current crisis is, it's also going to provide an opportunity for some innovation and people to look at things a little bit differently. And certainly policies, practices, and even the law will adapt to that.
I see a lot more work from home and bring your dog to work policies in our future.
Well, maybe next week we'll have a bring your dog to the video recording policy.
The weekly remote rundown with your pet. We've seen Sarah's cat walk across her computer screen the other day.
Yeah.
Why don't we take a few minutes and get some parting words of advice from each of you to clients and prospects, business owners out there who are going to be watching and listening to this recording. So let's start with Veronica.
Yeah, I would just say communicate with your employees, be as transparent as you can. And again, like I mentioned earlier, I think that helps alleviate some of the stress surrounding work issues right now. And just make sure you're checking resources and keeping up with what's going on, because as we've seen, things are changing daily and weekly. So that would be my advice.
Sarah?
Yeah, so even in times when we're not in crisis, I often advise clients that they should have their internal and external team always pretty filled out. So always, I think it's always good to have, your lawyer, your bookkeeper, your financial planner, to have your people in place, because you just never know when you're going to need them, and have those subject matter experts on hand that you trust and that know your business. I think that's even more important now. Really, just making sure that you are relying on people you need to rely on, getting the resources that you need, because, as you kind of mentioned throughout this, it's really the strategy, the planning portion of this, making sure that you're, crossing your T's, dotting your I's, and doing everything as well as you can to make it through this is really important. And there's a lot of good resources out there, and a lot of folks that are here to help. And so I think it's more important now than ever to reach out and stay on top of things, and so that you don't end up in a bad position on the opposite end of this when we all get through this. So I think that's a big piece. Strategy, planning, all in your hands, all the important things.
Russell?
Yeah, so this should probably come as no surprise to Jim, Veronica, and Sarah, but first step, just stay calm. There's no reason. I mean, this is a crisis, but panicking isn't really going to get you anywhere. So stay calm and just stay adaptable. I mean, things are changing. We don't know, when this is going to end, how exactly it's going to play out, whether there's going to be more stimulus from the government or not. Then, assuming there is, how we're going to pay for it all. Those are questions for another day. So, as business owners, I think the important advice is, stay calm, keep a level head. That'll help you be able to manage your employees and your team, and be flexible and understand that you're going to get thrown curveballs, and you just have to be patient and flow with it. On a more personal note, and to keep some sanity through all this, is I think it is important to laugh and take a deep breath, and it's a tough situation, but enjoy some parts of it as we go through it. So with that in mind, I'd like to point out the fact that I think during this recording that Veronica, Sarah, and I all used the conference call cliche of I'd like to piggyback on that. So if you'd like to play next week, if you'd like to play, if your kids are watching with you because you're at home, you can make this family bingo and see what cliches we use. And if you're watching alone and you want to make it a drinking game on a Friday afternoon when we'll release these, that sounds like a lot of fun too.
I think that's great advice. Well, thank you all for joining us for our first recording of the weekly remote rundown. And you can join us every Friday afternoon thereafter at the same time, same place, and we will continue to bring you sage advice from our three favorite labor and employment attorneys at Offit Kurman. So thank you all.